Welcome, everybody, to the Travelers Rest branch of the Greenville County Library System. I'm Rachel. I'm the Adult Outreach and Event Coordinator, and I'm so happy that you're all here joining us this evening. For a few housekeeping notes, if you don't mind just putting your cell phones on silent, and then if you need the restroom or water, they're right out there in the lobby. All right. If you are interested in our display materials, you can check out that table afterwards. They are all available for checkout. So you can grab those and then run over to the circulation desk and they'll be happy to help you check those out. If you're watching us on the live stream, I'll put the links to those materials available on the video recording later. All right, so we are so excited to welcome Dr. Roger Sneed. He's going to do his presentation, then leave some time for Q&A. I'll walk around with the microphone for those of you here, and if you're watching on the live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat. Dr. Roger Sneed is faculty chair at Furman University, where he's been a professor in the religion department since 2007. He teaches African American religious history and thought, Christian ethics, sexuality and Christian theologies, introduction to religion, and a host of other courses that address religion, culture, and society. He's a member of the American Academy of Religion, where he served as co-chair of the Gay Men and Religion Program Unit, a member of the Status of LGBTIQ Persons in the Profession Committee, and is currently a member of the AAR's Program Committee. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Roger Sneed.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction, and thank you for having me here tonight. I know, and thank you all for coming, especially on a very dreary, rainy day. Can you hear me? Are we good? Oh, so excellent. So I'll just dive right into it. So forgive me if I begin talking at warp speed. I do want to get through the lecture so I can take your questions. So here we go. The African encounter with Europeans, the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, segregation, and so forth can be described or read like a dystopian science fiction or horror narrative. Indeed, Cornel West calls this encounter the absurd, calling to mind popular science fiction's penchant for using monolithic and imposing terminology to characterize invading alien entities. These 5 centuries-long encounters with white supremacy seem so all-encompassing, so pervasive, that they threaten to completely short-circuit any imagination of a Black life beyond it. Our scholarly works are endeavors to show that Black folks have a history, have art, have sciences, and have religious worldviews independent of whiteness. Nevertheless, those endeavors are responses to white supremacist claims of Black deficiencies. Indeed, our writings and other cultural productions are inextricably tied to the absurd, to this white supremacist project that has positioned whiteness as inherently superior and any Black cultural productions as inherently deficient, and any Black history as insufficient, and any Black science as virtually non-existent. So when it comes to the presence of Black people in science fiction, the average layperson might say that there aren't many Black people in science fiction. Indeed, legend has it that when Whoopi Goldberg was a child and saw Lieutenant Uhura as part of the crew of the USS Enterprise, she ran to her mother and exclaimed that there was a Black woman on television and that she wasn't a maid. Not only have Black people struggled to be represented in science fiction, they have struggled for recognition as producers and consumers of science fiction. Unfortunately, Black people in science fiction, film, and television often follow the deeply problematic tropes that we find in other fiction genres. 20th and 21st century television and cinematic science fiction has presented a conundrum regarding the representations of Black people. On the one hand, to have at least one Black person in a supposedly non-stereotypical role may be groundbreaking. However, that role may still be presented within and through the white stereotypical gaze. In other words, such presentations of Blackness are typically presented vis-a-vis the lens of white supremacy. For example, consider the presence of Lando Calrissian in the original Star Wars trilogy. We first see him in Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, and to examine his presence in this movie is revealing. He is introduced as a friend of Han Solo and a last resort when Han, Leia, Chewbacca, C-3PO, and R2-D2 are on the run from Darth Vader. However, it becomes readily apparent that he is not only flamboyant, but also a liar out to protect his own ill-gotten interests. Further, he betrays Han, Leia, and Chewbacca to the Empire. Billy D. Williams' Calrissian is a stereotypical pimp. his capes and suave, predatory demeanor towards Leia signaling competition and a threat to Han Solo. His presence in the sequel Return of the Jedi is supposedly a form of redemption after he betrays Han, Leia, and Chewbacca to the Empire. And in Return of the Jedi, he flies the Millennium Falcon and helps destroy the new Death Star. That said, he had very little character development in the original trilogy. Further, the recent standalone Star Wars movie Solo was supposed to hint at Lando's pansexuality, but no such reference makes it into the final cut of the film. And again, the bulk of the character development in this movie is still left to Han Solo. Now, Star Trek, on the other hand, seems to fare somewhat better than Star Wars in terms of racial representation. Nearly every series in the franchise has included African Americans or Black people as part of the series, beginning with the late great Nichelle Nichols as Uhura in the original series. However groundbreaking her appearance as a series regular was, and we cannot underestimate the impact of her presence on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, since NBC executives wanted Gene Roddenberry to axe her from the show, Nichols nearly quit the series. In what is now a legendary narrative, worthy of the mythological status the series and the cast now occupy, Nichols encountered the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at a banquet where he urged her to remain on the show. According to a Vulture article that referenced a Reddit Ask Me Anything that Nichols participated in, King said something along the lines of, quote, "Nichelle, whether you like it or not, you have become a symbol. If you leave, they can replace you with a blonde-haired white girl and it will be like you were never there. What you've accomplished for all of us will only be real if you stay." And as a footnote, there's an episode, I think it's called The Doomsday Machine, which the communications officer was a blonde-haired woman, where Nichols was away from the show doing a play. So what King was saying came true, but she returned to the series. For the time period, her role was revolutionary in that she was not completely submissive, incompetent, or docile. I point to an early episode in which the crew becomes infected with some kind of virus that causes them to act in an intoxicated fashion, and the ship is imperiled as it spins out of control towards a disintegrating planet. An infected crewman not only seals off the engineering section and takes over control of communications, but he begins flooding all the channels with his drunken singing. Eventually, Captain Kirk snaps at Uhura to turn off the unceasing noise, to which she replies, "I've been trying. Don't you think that if I could, I would?" Such an outburst from a Black person to a white person, a commanding officer no less, would have been unthinkable in the 1960s. Further, Captain Kirk actually apologizes to Lieutenant Uhura. Another example of how Uhura was a revolutionary character was in the episode Who Mourns for Adonai, in which an entity that called itself Apollo jams communication frequencies between the Enterprise and the landing party. Uhura is tasked with rewiring the communication circuitry in order to break through the interference and informs Commander Spock that her task is delicate work, for which Mr. Spock says, "I can think of no one better equipped to handle the bypass work." As a result of her role, NASA asked her to help recruit minorities into the space agency. Again, the legendary nature of the show and Nichelle Nichols' role as a non-stereotypical Black woman was cemented when astronaut Mae Jemison became the first African-American woman to travel in space. She describes herself as a Star Trek fan, and according to her entry on the Star Trek wiki page Memory Alpha, would begin each shift on the Space Shuttle Endeavour by informing Mission Control in Houston that hailing frequencies were open, which was Lieutenant Uhura's signature phrase. Now, I want to turn to Afrofuturism. So, with the question of what is Afrofuturism? Afrofuturism may be described as Black people throughout the African diaspora taking science fiction, horror, fantasy, and other forms of speculative fiction and repurposing them into the service of more fully describing Black lives, experiences, and concerns. Those concerns tend to revolve around the appropriation and appreciation of racial, sexual, and gender difference, technological interventions that determine the regulation and distribution of social services and basic human needs, and how such technologies, like DNA markers or genetic testing, are deeply informed by racism, sexism, and homophobia, and become further forms of oppressive social control. Simply put, when looking at white supremacy, Black people were not supposed to imagine the future, much less write or sing about it. Indeed, Black people's songs about a future were confined to the spirituals and gospel music as part of the life of the church. Even then, those pleas were to be addressed to a white God, a white church, and a white Jesus. Afrofuturism is another element in Black people's history of taking the scraps left behind by white supremacist structures and institutions and turning them into enduring cultural productions, like what Black folks have done with clothing, cuisine, and religion. Science fiction was never supposed to be a space for Black people. Now, the term itself was coined by Mark Derry in Black to the Future, Interviews with Samuel R. Delany, Greg Tate, and Tricia Rose from 1994. Mark Derry claimed that claims regarding Black producers of science fiction may be problematic. For example, he asserts that there are few African Americans who write science fiction, an assumption that upon deeper exploration yields far more than a few African Americans who've written science fiction. But the term that he coined has persisted and taken hold in such a way as to become the primary way by which we describe African American, African, and other diasporic African sci-fi works. An example of the productive use of the term is found in Ytasha Womack's book Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Culture, published in 2013. Describing herself as an Afrofuturist before the term existed, Womack argues that any sci-fi fan, don't jump ahead. Any sci-fi fan, comic book geek, fantasy reader, trekker, or science fair winner who ever wondered why Black people are minimized in pop culture depictions of the future, conspicuously absent from the history of science, or marginalized in the roster of past inventors, and then actually set out to do something about it, could arguably qualify as an Afrofuturist as well, end quote. Now, her description of the Afrofuturist is far-ranging. Her description is also democratic, critical, and visionary. The any is, to me, diagnostic in that any person who wishes to center Black lives and experiences through speculative fiction could be considered an Afrofuturist. Such a conception of the Afrofuturist has been used to read Black science fiction literary productions back into African American literary history. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois's 1920 apocalyptic short story, The Comet, is a pioneering work in Black science fiction. It outlines the aftermath of Earth passing through a comet's tail, the devastation that it wreaks, and the journey of two survivors of the devastation. In the case of this story, the first survivor we encounter, and the point of view from which the story is told, is a Black man. In the moments before the disaster, he is a messenger sent by a white bank president into the dank, disgusting, and dangerous vaults beneath the bank to retrieve old records. The story begins by establishing his position in the social order of New York. Quote, "Few noticed him. Few ever noticed him, save in a way that stung. He was outside the world. Nothing," as he said bitterly, end quote. His nobodiness is clearly reinforced by the demand that he go into the lower vaults. It was too dangerous for valuable men. However, that dangerous work appears to be that which saves him from the disastrous effects of the approaching comet's tail, for once he ascends out of the vaults, he sees that everyone is dead. Apparently, no one heeded the warnings splayed across newspapers that cautioned people to close their doors and windows and seek the cellar. Wandering the dead-strewn streets of Manhattan, Jim presently encounters another survivor of the comet, a young white woman. What follows might call to mind a form of recreation story, a hopeful moment in which the two survivors of this disaster become a new Adam and Eve, remaking the world beyond its racist foundations. Amidst this death and destruction, Jim and Julia seem ready to embrace a new destiny. Du Bois writes, quote, "A vision of the world had risen before her. Slowly the mighty prophecy of her destiny overwhelmed her. Above the dead past hovered the angel of Annunciation. She was no mere woman. She was neither high nor low, white nor black, rich nor poor. She was primal woman, mighty mother of all men to come, and the bride of life. She looked upon the man beside her and forgot all else but his manhood, his strong, vigorous manhood, his sorrow and sacrifice. She saw him glorified. He was no longer a thing apart, a creature below, a strange outcast of another clime and blood, but her brother, humanity incarnate, Son of God and great All-Father to the race to be, end quote. Du Bois weaves a religious sentiment into this narrative. Julia is not just going to be the Eve, mother of new creation. Jim is now both the incarnation and Odin. And here Du Bois transforms a white god and recasts it into the form of a black man. Julia, most likely through her own inheritance of white supremacy, saw herself as part of a prophecy. Julia is now ready to shed herself of the racism that the old order had imposed upon her, and Jim is ready to walk into a new world in which his possibilities are not constrained. But the utopia that Jim and Julia envision is rudely interrupted. They are not the only survivors of this apocalypse. It was only New York City that experiences the destructive force of the comet. Du Bois could have done a Michael Bay movie. The survivors that Jim and Julia encounter immediately resurrect the violent and virulent racism that was supposed to have been part of this extinguished old order. And that said, excuse me, Afrofuturism is not limited to literary visions. I go on at length in the book about why we seem to be tied to books as the only way to talk about science fiction. An interdisciplinary, multi-format field, Afrofuturism engages nearly every form of cultural production. As Womack puts it, Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. It is a field of experimentation in which the Afrofuturist can engage music, art, or any other form of cultural production in order to center and reimagine Black lives and experiences. Now here, I'd like to turn to Star Trek Deep Space Nine, or DS9 for short, as another example of the power of Afrofuturism. This particular iteration of Trek was led by an African-American male captain who had a son, a female first officer who was a former terrorist, and a host of culturally diverse and morally ambiguous people on a backwater space station. And it is at this place where Captain Benjamin Sisko encounters aliens known as the Prophets. These are non-corporeal entities that exist outside of normal space-time and live within a wormhole that connects the Alpha Quadrant to the distant Gamma Quadrant. The Bajorans, a highly spiritual humanoid race, worship these prophets, and by the end of the first episode of the series, the prophets have designated Sisko as their emissary. And by extension, the Bajorans come to revere Sisko as the emissary of the prophets. This is a position that Sisko initially rejects, reflecting the secularized skepticism of Starfleet, the Federation, and by extension, the larger Star Trek mythos. Now, in the 6th season, there's an episode called Far Beyond the Stars, in which Captain Sisko is feeling the weight of the Federation's war with the Dominion and contemplating resigning from Starfleet. As he is talking to his father, who is visiting the station, Benjamin sees a man dressed in 1950s attire walk in front of his office. Soon, he not only begins seeing things from the 50s, he finds himself in the 1950s. Further, he is no longer Captain Benjamin Sisko. Instead, he is Benny Russell, a science fiction writer living in New York City. Here we go with New York City again. From that point forward, the story takes place in 1950s New York as though that setting constitutes the real world. Benny writes for a sci-fi magazine called Incredible Tales, and he becomes entranced with by a drawing of the space station and takes it home. Can I get some water? Oh, yeah, thanks. After an encounter with some racist street cops, Benny meets a black street preacher who tells him to write the words that will set men free to show people that which is to come. In this sense, the street preacher is exhorting Benny Russell to write an apocalypse, a revelation of a future that is to come. Eventually, Benny writes a story called Deep Space Nine, and despite everyone in the office loving the story, the editor refuses to publish the story because the story's protagonist, named Benjamin Sisko, is a black man who commands the station. To the editor's thinking, no one will accept a story in which the captain of a space station is a black man. As a matter of fact, the editor says it could cause a race riot. To the editor's thinking, Oh, it would appear that the editor is correct, as shown when Benny tells a friend of his named Jimmy that he is writing about Black people in space, and Jimmy derisively dismisses him and the story. And in fact, it is the only time the N word has ever been uttered in a Star Trek series, where Jimmy says they are never going to see us as anything but. Benny's girlfriend, Cassie, is more concerned with the two of them settling into a quiet life in which she runs the restaurant where she works, and Benny could write for a Black-owned newspaper. Nevertheless, Benny writes 6 more stories about Deep Space Nine and Captain Sisko. Further, he begins to see the people in his world as the characters he created. For example, as his co-workers are reading his story, he sees Kay Eaton as Bajoran Major Kira Nerys, and the aforementioned racist street cops take the forms of representatives from the authoritarian and totalitarian Cardassians and Dominion. Further, as Benny writes more stories, his realities begin to blur. He is becoming Benjamin Sisko and fears that he is losing his mind. And in order to get his first story published, Benny agrees to a compromise and makes the entire story a dream. However, this compromise is not enough. Mr. Stone, the unseen owner of the magazine, halts the entire magazine's run and fires Benny. Benny has a nervous breakdown in the office, and here's where I will turn. As you see here, he's beginning to see himself as Benjamin Sisko. But here's the scene where he is fired. So I will play a couple of scenes. The next scene takes place when an ambulance comes and takes Benny away. And the final is the kind of the conclusion of the episode where Benjamin Sisko is talking to his father. At the conclusion of this episode, Benjamin Sisko is talking to his father, and Benjamin Sisko says, well, what if far beyond all those distant stars, Benny Russell is dreaming of us? So as we look at this episode, Russell's inspiration is to build an entire galactic federation that emphasizes mutual understanding and cooperation that is free from racism, hatred, and so forth, is to me constitutive of Black science fiction writing. Black science fiction writers have long used the medium as a way of critiquing oppressive structures that deal death and misery to Black people. And it wouldn't be surprising that a Black sci-fi writer in the 1950s might create a future world in which racism no longer governs the lives of Black people. And in the case of Benny Russell, he reframes the implacable, insatiable desire for domination that comprises white supremacy into the form of the Dominion. And if we think of Black prophetic imagination as an active resistance to the death-dealing forces of white supremacy, then I would read Russell's creation of Deep Space Nine as defiance, that Black people will not only survive and flourish well into the 24th century, but we will also rise to command the most important outpost in the Federation, as well as one of the most powerful ships in the quadrant. Like Afrofuturists in our world, Russell uses the medium of science fiction to reframe the lives of Black people in his world. For example, instead of being a struggling restaurant waitress, Cassie is now Cassidy Yates, a fearless freighter captain. Jimmy, the wayward youth who was shot by police officers, is now Sisko's son, Jake, who in the world created by Russell is a successful writer in his own right. For Black people to write themselves into a future is to adopt and adapt a hope that does not rely on an otherworldly afterlife. While the future in which Benny Russell dreams of, the future that he dreams of is neither a religious heaven nor an unblemished utopia, Russell, to me, functions as St. John the Divine, receiving and relating a revelation at the end of oppression. As such, when the Spirit, in the form of the preacher, urges Benny to write the words that will lead us out of darkness, Benny outlines a vision of the future in which the descendants of the oppressed receive vindication. Here, the new heaven and new earth are humans of all races, pushing out into the stars and transforming Earth into a virtual paradise. I read Russell as presenting Deep Space Nine as a gospel of liberation that stands as fulfillment of James Cone's theological project. I could get into that in conversation. When the prophet speaks to Benny and urges him to write the words that will lead us out of darkness, I see the prophet as the indwelling, inspiring spirit that empowers the oppressed person to engage in prophetic utterances. Further, when the prophet, who in the world of the Federation that Russell creates is Benjamin Sisko's father, tells Russell first that hope and despair often walk hand in hand, and then that there is no greater glory than to walk in the path of the prophets, I read these statements as science fictional representations of divine wisdom. This, to me, is a kind of prophetic imagination in action. And this representation of divine wisdom through human voices, must be driven by a kind of passion that allows for cunning, ironic approaches to the world. The work of the dreamer is cunning, and that is, it is subversive. Benny Russell uses the medium of science fiction to subvert white supremacy, to throw its racist imaginary into turmoil. Again, going back to the editors saying that this story could cause a race riot. The United Federation of Planets, Deep Space Nine, and the multiracial, multicultural crew are the indictments against a white supremacist imaginary and show a world in which the white supremacist imaginary has finally been rendered inert. Thank you. Well, I think in Deep Space Nine, which I think is probably the most, if you're talking about Star Trek, right? Or if we're using Star Trek as an example, right? I think that what you see in Star Trek is this kind of exporting our kind of worst impulses onto aliens, which itself becomes problematic. Now, I think what Deep Space Nine does is then says, wait a minute, human beings, yes, we're better, but we're not perfect. I think in one episode, Sisko says, well, it's easy to be a saint in paradise. Human beings are more enlightened, but yet still not perfect. And that implacable enemies are often enemies because they lack an understanding or they're operating out of fear. Now, again, the original series, which itself was a mirror of the world in its time. So you see the Klingons as kind of this fear about Russia, and you see the Romulans as kind of a fear about the Chinese. So science fiction can often take our worst impulses and then put them onto an alien. I think Gene Roddenberry's dictum when Star Trek The Next Generation came out was that there was to be no conflict among the crew, among the human crew of the Enterprise. All the conflict came from the aliens of the week. But that doesn't make for good drama. So again, by the time Deep Space Nine comes along, it's characterized as the darker science Star Trek show where people aren't perfect. People are doing all things like bribing people or, lots of murder, not a lot of murder, but you have, like I would say, an examination of the Federation and say, okay, well, wait a minute, what does it mean to be in this? So, yes, again, that's really Star Trek.
Any other questions?
I'm curious, since we're still on the Star Trek theme, like how does Benjamin Sisko change after this experience? Because he basically returns back to being on Deep Space Nine, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he still is he still reflecting on his journey from the past? Is he like thinking about how is he a symbol now for the future? Like what does he now think being in the future, what he experienced from the past?
Well, at the end of that particular episode, he wakes up in sickbay, or the infirmary, not sickbay. He wakes up in the infirmary, and only a couple of minutes have passed. And when he is back in his quarters talking to his father, he says, "Okay, I'm going to finish what I've started." He says, "I'm going to stay the course." And then his father starts quoting the Bible. And so I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. And Ben says, "I've never known you to quote from the Bible before." It's almost kind of a frightening moment because his father, he says this with such conviction that it's unnerving, especially in a Star Trek series that tends to not deal with religion, or at least not well, or a franchise that doesn't deal with religion well. So he stays, obviously he stays. Actually, the visions that he has as Benny Russell come back in, I believe, at the beginning of the seventh season. Uh, but I don't want to dive into. And the producers of the series had an idea of maybe ending the series with Benny Russell walking through a Paramount soundstage where they were filming Deep Space Nine. So they played with this idea of ending DS9 with this being Benny Russell's creation. Actually, Benny Russell does show up in an episode, not the author, not Benny Russell, but in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is set right before the original series, we see a person reading a fantasy novel written by Benny Russell. So there's a lot of kind of meta-narrative at work here, which I would leave to my colleagues who are in communications or do philosophy. I don't want to dive into those waters. But for Sisko, he has become more comfortable with the role of being emissary to the prophets. And we actually find out that his mother was actually one of the prophets. So he then gets a kind of immaculate conception narrative by the seventh season. So, yeah.
So I take it from this that you have an affinity for Star Trek. Other than Star Trek, what would be your favorite work of science fiction and why?
Babylon 5. Actually, Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine were premiered around the same time. And some sci-fi fans argue that Paramount stole the idea because I think J. Michael Straczynski pitched Babylon 5 to Paramount, but they said, nah. But both series are set on a space station. Both series have very deeply interwoven narratives about religion. So people are like, yeah, y'all stole this. But I love Babylon 5, which J. Michael Straczynski described as a novel written for television. So each season was meticulously planned out. I like Star Wars. I actually prefer Andor. If you have Disney Plus, Andor is just amazing. It's amazing television. Each episode is like reading a chapter out of a good book. Let's see. Oh, The Expanse was really, the series was good. The books kind of petered out towards the end, but such happens when you have 9 books in a series. Gosh. I would say my holy trinity of science fiction is Star Trek, Superman, and Star Wars. So, yeah.
Viewers asks if you can recommend some additional science fiction written by Black authors with a liberation theme.
Okay, there's Maurice Brodus's Sweep of Stars. I think it's part of his it's an Afrofuturistic saga. I don't know if there's another book that has come out yet, but Sweep of Stars. I should probably say that I don't read a lot of science fiction novels. N.K. Jemison's The City That We Became is amazing. It was based on a short story that appeared in her collection of short stories called How Long Till Black Future Month. So yeah, I think the second book came out. I haven't finished that one yet. One of my problems is that I get impatient when I try to read a book. So I usually either put it down or then I just skip to the end. And then, so I don't have a lot of, I would probably leave this lecture and go, oh, I forgot about that book. And then I forgot about that book. But I would say Sweep of Stars was, Tade Thompson's book, Rosewater. Tade Thompson, T-A-D-E Thompson, Rosewater. It was the trilogy. I think he finished the trilogy, but once again, I think I got to the second book and, I think I finished it, but I don't really remember what I read. So yeah.
There's some good options. Does anyone else have questions? I see people are frantically typing in the titles. That's great. We will put those titles in the video description if you want to check those out later.
Well, that was the problem with the supporting crew in the original series. We don't know much about them. So there's no point, no way in which they can be imperfect. I think one of the problems that I have with people who criticize Uhura in the original series, like I think there's an episode of In Living Color, which an old sketch comedy series. Yeah, where it's called The Wrath of Farrakhan. And I think it was David Alan Grier playing Louis Farrakhan, or it was one of the Wayans brothers, I think, who is on the bridge of the Enterprise, and he says, you know, my Nubian sister, how long have we seen only the back of your nappy weave? You know, and you're only answering these phone calls. And I'm thinking that is how you, if you're not in this world, how you see this character as just reduced to saying hailing frequencies open captain. And not understanding that, yeah, by the third season of the series, it was on its way out because the executives wanted to cancel the show. So, yeah, I mean, what do we know about Uhura, about Sulu, about Chekhov? We don't, I mean, because the show tends to revolve around Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. So, you know, we don't get much backstory about Uhura, at least not until, really not even in the movies. It's not until, and a lot of fans start to try to fill in the gaps and say, okay, well, she's probably from she's from the United Nations of Africa, that Africa, the continent, has united and become its kind of its own political entity. And that it was fan writers who gave her the first name Nyota. So, I mean, again, we didn't know her first name, and it didn't become canon until the 2009 J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies. So they're flawless only because we know nothing about them, or next to nothing.
Okay, we have time for one more question. No? Okay, well, we will say thank you to Dr. Sneed. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
And if you'd like more detail, you can, of course, buy or check out his book, The Dreamer in the Dream, Afrofuturism and Black Religious Thought. We do have a copy on that table there, but I'll also have the link in the video description, so you can purchase it if you want to reference it at home. So thank you so much for coming, and follow our YouTube channel, Greenville Library, or follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and you can find out about all these wonderful presentations that we have coming up. And we are just so grateful for Dr. Sneed to come and present to us at the library. So thank you so much, and thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening tonight.